All right, our first interview is with Ron Palmieri. Many people don't know that when you make a Google Voice call, that is, or was Grand Central, which Ron built. And today he's working on Layer, which, hi Ron, and Don. So he's working on Layer, which is a communication platform used by the Web Summit of all things. I think 50,000 people helped them communicate with each other, network, and all kinds of other stuff. Interviewing him is the legendary Don Clark, who spent, I think, 20, 30 years at the Wall Street Journal here, and recently retired to pursue his true passion, which is music. Anyway, gentlemen, please.
Great, thanks, Nino.
Give warm,
Good morning.
Warm round of applause for Ron.
It's very nice to be here in downtown Redwood City, one of my favorite places.
What was that?
Only 23 years at the Wall Street Journal, but it just seems like 3 decades. So it's very nice to be here with Ron, who is a true veteran of the industry. He's seen it both from an investor and a CEO standpoint. And I'd just like to kick off by asking Ron to sort of characterize the environment we're in right at the moment. What's it like to start a company now versus, say, 5, 10 years ago?
Yeah, it's an interesting moment in time, actually, because Don and I were chatting a little bit before about kind of the shifts that are going on in the industry. One of course, is that you've got these 5 giant companies that appear to be really driving a lot of the core technical innovation around things like cloud, machine learning, and mobile. And so, as an entrepreneur, you've got to find this space that you can build something into. So that's certainly kind of one is how do you go about thinking about the market and where are there interesting product opportunities. You've also, the other idea though is a lot of these trends like machine learning and the cloud really give entrepreneurs so many tools to leverage that really were never available to previous sort of generations of entrepreneurs. So the idea that you could build something, deploy it to AWS, and have something that can scale as you grow is pretty amazing. So I think it's a combination of things. I mean, I've been at this for a while as well, and kind of remember when people used to talk about how IBM was the power, then Microsoft was the power, and then Google was the power. I mean, and now it's Facebook or Amazon. There's always some giant company that's setting kind of the current agenda. But from an entrepreneur standpoint, it's always about finding kind of like where are the opportunities going forward. So I think there's never been a better time. But as always, there are challenges to kind of navigate around.
So circling around to the funding environment, a lot of the venture capitalists seem to have pulled in their horns a little bit. And I'm just kind of wondering what it takes to convince somebody to write you a check these days.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we've seen, so from Layer standpoint, we launched in 2013, and the funding environment was very positive. So we launched at TechCrunch Disrupt, and that kind of my joke is if any of you have seen HBO Silicon Valley, we were the guys on the stage with the big check. Money was definitely more free then. I think there was also a lot of opportunity around kind of mobile, social stuff. Like one of our earlier customers is a company called Yik Yak that Sequoia had invested $75 million into to potentially become like the next Instagram. And they recently closed down and I think did kind of an acqui-hire. So the idea that there was $75 million available for something that in that kind of mobile social space is hard to imagine now. But I do think that there are plenty of great companies, both the seed stage, Series A, Series B, that are getting funded. But it's really fundamentally about having a clear idea of the product in the market and demonstrating that kind of the fundamental premise of what you're doing is working.
So when you're talking to that financier, what kind of evidence do they want to see that? I mean, as we were talking, it's not just that you have an idea but maybe that it's been refined and it has some traction. What sort of evidence are they looking for to sort of show that you're catching on or you have something?
Yeah, well, I think it's still, I mean, the old kind of the idea that it's always about the team, the technology and the market is still sound. I think the interesting part about this though is it's so much easier to build something, using various kinds of tools, whether it's AWS or something like Layer. And so I think what they're looking for is evidence that as you've iterated, and this is something we were chatting about earlier as well, there's an opportunity to continue to iterate and prove the value of what you're doing. I think ultimately, the way I kind of think about these things is early stage companies are a bit like a logic proof in that it's based on a series of sort of true statements. So I don't know if any of you have taken formal logic, but it's an interesting way to kind of prove that what you're doing is kind of sound, because each supporting statement of the reason you're doing your thing needs to be true. And so I think ultimately, if you're saying there is a market opportunity here, how can you prove it and prove it cheaply with real customers that are demonstrating that they validate that. Also, the team is always going to be critical. So, one of the challenges I'll always say to, for example, to non-technical founders, it's really important to have a core technology foundation. So, having a team, being able to recruit a team that represents the core of what you're building is really critical. And then obviously the market is always important, because if you're going after a large market, you have some time to kind of navigate around. I mean, Layer has gone through a 4-year journey, starting out with a pretty apps where people could build things, and now we're seeing the enterprise as a much bigger opportunity for us. So I think it's about the evolution and ultimately being able to demonstrate the three fundamentals, which is the team, the core technology you're building in the market.
So just to circle on the founders for a moment, we've had some huge success stories, built with unproven entrepreneurs in the past 10 years. Your Boxes and Dropboxes and Facebooks and things. You talk about the team, the technology. How important is it to have a team with a track record versus just some really impressive young guy?
Yeah, well, I think the team, and by team too, I don't necessarily mean just somebody who's got track record. In fact, I think a lot of times it'll be somebody that has a clear insight into something, and you look at a lot of these guys, whether it's Zuckerberg. I think he managed to really demonstrate that he not only especially as they kind of executed. Ultimately, like growth. If you have that kind of growth, then by definition you've got kind of the right team. I think is a little bit of that, right. that sort of like self-fulfilling prophecy, right. I guess. But there are definitely you'll hear VCs say we like people that have like done one or two things already in the market they're going after because somebody else paid for the learning, basically. Right. So that's where you can say an experienced founder might be of interest, but also it doesn't preclude. In fact, if anything, the Valley is very fond of that young entrepreneur who is passionate and driven and working 24/7 to build a business. So I don't think it necessarily it means experience as much as is that person sort of intrinsically in a great position to solve the problem they're going after.
So let's focus a little bit more on the kind of opportunities out there. I think there's some that have been well picked over. Where do you see where are the things that have been picked over, and where do you see the sort of more promising avenues at the moment?
Yeah, well, I think solving real problems that customers are willing to pay for is always a good strategy. One of the things that we see is that if you think about the intersection of again, cloud computing, AI and machine learning, and mobile, the way I kind of look at this, and again, it depends on one's experience base, but for me, when I saw the browser, the first time, it just, to me, it felt like this sort of big bang of, almost the equivalent of the universe being created, and all these amazing opportunities came out of that, companies like Amazon and others, obviously. I think we're at that point with mobile right now. I think if you think about the last 25 years of things that have been built for the desktop web, those are going to be remade for mobile. When we carry these devices with us all the time, there's an opportunity to build entirely different kinds of experiences, whether it's in insurance or healthcare or certainly retail. There's a lot of interesting experiments that are and great companies that have been built there. So I think that a lot of this is really, again, looking at where you can deeply understand a customer's challenge and build something using, I think mobile represents kind of this completely large, decade forward opportunity for people to build great companies. But obviously, the big guys are already aware of mobile. It's not like it's a secret. So it's very much around finding those spots where you can do something unique.
So not to give a commercial for Layer, but maybe just to flesh this out a little with a concrete example. Talk a little bit about what you guys do in terms of a kind of a mobile conversation with a customer.
Yeah, very kind of you to ask that question. Yeah, so basically the idea for Layer came from having done Grand Central, which is Google Voice, and that was all about the phone system. So the big premise was communications are going to move off the phone system into the internet. That's like a giant frame. After we launched, we had about 10,000 requests for early access after the Disrupt thing, which was crazy to see. I kind of joke people imprinting their hopes and dreams on what we were doing. What we've really gotten clear about now that we're about 4 years into this is really companies have to remake the way they communicate with their customers. So we're powering these web and mobile experiences that feel more mobile forward, so kind of messaging at their core, but allowing companies to communicate on the devices, whether it's an Amazon Alexa kind of interface, or it's a phone, or a tablet, or a desktop. So our vision is really about this shifting of the way people want to communicate from the phone, email, and things that have been built for the desktop web. So it's everything from helping companies sell products to customers in a more efficient, effective way, and then also providing a more contextualized support experience as part of this one-to-one conversation. So we look at healthcare, helping people find access to the right healthcare services. We see financial services like wealth management or mortgages or credit card is an interesting one. Travel, my example there is I get a push notification from my airline that says my flight's been canceled, and the only option is to call them despite the fact that I have the mobile app on my phone. So there's a real opportunity to kind of remake communications. I also love communications, having done it my entire career, because I kind of put it up there with a basic human need, kind of almost after air and water. So it's one of finding something that represents like a constant remaking, reshaping, driven by technology is a pretty useful thing.
So you mentioned AI a couple times. Obviously, in the background of a chat with an automated, say, a airline system, automation AI would be a huge benefit. Where do you see the humans remaining? I think there are places for them.
Absolutely. Well, so one of the ideas basically is anywhere that requires empathy is sort of the obvious place for humans. So, and it's interesting too, because if you think about the great example using airlines is the reaccommodation that United did recently, dragging somebody off an airline. I mean, the fact they called it a reaccommodation, I thought was hilarious.
Most people don't have to be hospitalized for those.
After they're reaccommodated. So the interesting thing there is that that was a problem of the systems, like literally dehumanizing the people that were sort of executing the policy. And I think we have an opportunity with technology to kind of flip it the other way around, which is to have the technology really enable people to spend their time on things that leverage the humanity and the empathy that human beings have. And so when we think about a lot of these interactions, so many of them are horrible. Like, you call a call center, you go through an IVR, you have to tell your life story, you get transferred to somebody else, you have to tell your life story again. Those are all crappy experiences that are based on the limitations of technology today. And I think the real opportunity is to kind of flip that and free the human beings to basically do things that really require thinking and as I said, at the core, empathy, which is something that I don't expect AI to be doing anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. Some people say that data is the new oil. The frightful five, one of the reasons they are so frightful is that they've got the data already. Yeah. You're a startup, you don't necessarily have access to that. How can you leverage AI in that kind of a world where maybe you don't have the access to start out with all that data?
Yeah, that's great. It's funny. I was at this conference recently, and Stephen Wolfram, who runs Wolfram Alpha, yeah, he and I were having this exact conversation in the context of the ethics of AI as well, which was an interesting chat. The real issue is no matter what you're doing, there's always data in context. So, like for example, Layer is not a frightful five, but we power the communications experiences for tons of companies and do millions of conversations a day and all this kind of stuff. We have a lot of data that we can do things on behalf of our customers. So I think it comes down to the context. I mean, obviously, the data that Facebook has or the data that Google has or Amazon is monstrous, and they have they can do things that startups can't. But I would say unless you have there's an element of the data as part of, it has to be part of every single startup, because you're doing something for customers and then there's data that's thrown off by it. You need to constantly be thinking about how to take advantage of that and use it to continue to enhance the experience you're creating.
So just generally, having seen a lot of companies, help them start, et cetera, what are some of the biggest mistakes you see young companies make?
Yeah, so I have a few very strong points of view about this one, actually. So one is you have to prove things cheap. And what I mean by that is, really, if you have a premise, go out and get very objective feedback. I kind of joke that, the smarter you are, the better you are at deceiving yourself. So you really have to be objective about the feedback you get. I like to tell this story. Aaron Patzer, who started Mint, went out with, if you guys ever, Mint's been now acquired by Intuit for a bunch of years, but Aaron tells a story about going to the train station with his original design, hand-drawn, and showing it to people who were kind of like regular people, not founders or whatever, and people were confused, and then he came back with something simpler, and they were still confused, and eventually came up with something that was like 1/10 of what he imagined doing kind of on that initial landing page, and people finally got it. And that was all with hand-drawn, they call them wireframes or whatever, but being able to prove your premise cheaply, not building a ton of tech that you then have to throw away. It's a lot easier to erase a whiteboard than it is to throw away a year's worth of code. So that's kind of one mistake. I think people go too deep and fall in love with their idea without being objective. So that's kind of one. The other is really just make sure you know who your intended customer is. A lot of lessons for early stage companies is build something and whatever. The problem is that if you're going to find a really interesting large market, you really need to be, again, objective about who you're building for and hear that feedback and iterate on that.
Is there anything you'd point to in the area of mistakes that relate to funding or interactions with VCs?
Yeah, well, the funny part about the VC thing is it's kind of cyclical. So there have been times where VCs have been like, don't worry about profitability, don't worry about building a real business, it's growth overall. And then all of a sudden you wake up one day and that is completely flipped.
Yes.
So it's one of these things where I think you have to be really clear about what you're doing and not kind of get caught up in because there are VCs who have been consistently high performing because they don't do those dramatic, almost like faddish swings.
Right.
So I think you have to be a little bit careful about having a VC tell you what to do because it's not their business, it's your business, and unless they've already written a large check, and even then you want to be somewhat circumspect about the advice you get. So I would say not be overly susceptible to the swings, and especially make sure that the feedback that you're getting, either when you're pitching or even if you've got a VC on your board or in your company, that you fundamentally are executing to what you believe is core rather than sort of being whiplashed to a certain extent by what you hear from VCs.
Yeah, we're certainly in a phase, I think, where we flip the other way toward cautiousness.
Right.
Is there anything about, say, the size of early rounds or anything about that as far as, do you want to, how deep do you want to get in with these people?
Well, the crazy part about it is it really feels like the things we called the rounds have kind of shifted up. So like a seed round used to be of a certain size, and now which now is kind of equivalent to what Series A's used to be, and it's an interesting kind of thing that's kind of happened. I think that in the early stage, really proving what you're doing on as little money as possible gives you optionality. And if you're doing well, the money, like the worst part about raising money is it's easy to raise money when you don't need it. It's very hard to raise it when you do,
Yeah.
So it's this thing where the more you can control that. So take as little money as possible until you really feel that you've proven the underlying fundamentals, I think is a really important lesson. Mm-hmm. It's one thing for somebody who's on their third company and they have easy access to capital, but I'd say the less money you can raise early, the better, because it gives, instead of it being like, oh, I just raised a $10 million seed round, you're like, that sounds like a Series A, that kind of stuff. I think it's better to not be focusing on the amount you raise, but try to really make sure you're raising enough to do what you need to do to kind of prove each stage of the company.
So putting on your sort of former VC investor hat a little bit more, could you talk a little bit about some really good ideas or really bad ideas that came along and what happened?
Yeah, let me think about that one. I mean, the cool part about the early stage stuff is that sometimes it's really hard to determine what's good and what's bad, and so I mean, like there's great stories about how Mark Benioff couldn't get a VC to touch him with a 10-foot pole when they were kind of doing their thing, or Uber certainly is another good example. I kind of have this joke that you don't judge, because you can't, unless you're going to live in that seat, you can't, you can give feedback, but ultimately who knows which ideas are going to be good or bad. I mean, a lot of the stuff I've seen, is really just more about how do you refine the idea. Like the story I like to tell about the original Grand Central was the first product was based on Flash, and it was like the entire page was orange. And I was like, and so we ended up kind of refining it down to where, the initial product was really, really nice and had a very small sort of accent of orange. I mean, you see a lot of bad ideas, but that doesn't mean the core of them but you see things that appear bad, but at the core they could still be really solid. Mm-hmm. So it's important to kind of just refine down if you have an idea, to really test it and see if it holds up with what you think is kind of core.
So for most of my early years in the Valley, the IPO was the thing you looked out on the horizon, and everybody could go, back in the 90s, or most people could. That has certainly not been the case for quite a while now. What is sort of the financial dream, do you think, these days? Is it, you malinger for 2 years and then you get bought by Amazon or somebody big, or what's sort of like the end goal do you see?
Well, I think the good part about it is there have been successful IPOs recently. I mean, I think there was a couple of years where, you literally, you would only have the ability of being acquired by one of, 5 or 6 companies if you throw like a Cisco kind of in there as
right.
well. I think the fact that companies have gone out and had pretty decent IPOs is really healthy, because if it really came down to like an oligopoly of a handful of companies that were the sole sources of exit, that creates really bad dynamics of people that are building for acquisition rather than building for markets. So good companies have gone out. The problem, the challenge, I guess, is that it's $100 million in revenue now, which is a lot harder to get to. So
you'd say $100 million in revenue is sort of the place where an acquisition becomes possible,
or
an
an
IPO.
Yeah, I think,
right.
you can get acquired if you've got no revenue.
Right.
Obviously, the numbers will be smaller. But yeah, if you want to go public, I think now you have to have a sustainable business, at $100 million. You even look at like Snapchat went out and then, with their first earnings report, got hammered. It's to go out, you need to be a real business with predictability.
Mm-hmm. So we keep coming back to the Frightful Five. In that kind of environment, you have situations, for example, where AWS is kind of like the host for many people, and some people tell me, well, they find out, 6 months later they've made the feature in their product that was my business.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things happen.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of wondering, what are some of the pitfalls and strategies for avoiding them when you have, such powerful giants?
Yeah, the unfortunate reality is you can't control what they do, and they're fast following now, faster than ever. The most recent example was, the Echo came out. Amazon had put $3 or $4 million into a company. They basically incorporated everything they did into the most recent version of the Echo. Uh-huh. That's always going to be a challenge. So I think you have to, more than ever, be clear about what you're doing and why. I don't know there's any way to avoid that, unfortunately. These are like giant companies that actually are increasingly, even look at, again, Facebook slavishly picking off every feature that Snap does.
Right.
And so it is tricky, but again, I think if you focus on markets where you understand deeply what there is, that is differentiator. I also like enterprise businesses because it's unlikely Facebook is going to build an enterprise feature. Amazon obviously now is, but yeah, you can't, if you're going to start a company, you have to go for it. You can't worry about that because
right.
it's not outside of your control.
So now we do have Microsoft and Google, the enterprise part of Google, trying to make Amazon's life a little harder and trying to be the number 2 and number 3 and move up in the hosting infrastructure ranks. Do you see anything they're doing to try to, to having an impact in the competition and how that affects startups?
That Microsoft specifically?
Microsoft and Google.
And Google, yeah. Okay.
Microsoft Azure and Google.
I'll be fast. Yeah, I mean, so it's going to this is like a fundamental part of the computing infrastructure. You're going to have Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, battling it out. One way to view it is it's excellent for businesses that are trying to take advantage of those services because there's good competition. It's going to get cheaper. The hard part is if you're building something that kind of fits narrowly within that context, that white space is going to get collapsed. So, but I do think the enterprise market is a massive opportunity, and the consumer feels a little played out right now. So I would say focus on things that add value to enterprise, and there's a good opportunity there.
Great. Do I see that we are reaching the end?
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much,
Thanks,
Ron
everybody.
Palmeri.